Will you join me in welcoming Kirrily Robert?
They asked me to come in today and talk about women in open source, and particularly about two projects I've been involved in this year that have a majority of women involved. But before I start with that, I'd like to just give you a bit of context. This is what the open source community looks like. I'd like to challenge you here to spot the women in the photo. Or actually the woman. I'll give you a tip. She's on the right. The open source community has 1.5% of women, according to the FlossPolls survey in 2006. I ran a survey of the Perl community in 2007 and found 5% women. Some communities do a little better. The Drupal community, 10%. The technology industry overall, anywhere between 10 and 30%. Let's call it 30. Let's call it 20, rather. So what you see is that anywhere in any technical community, generally speaking, women are in a minority. But here in the open source community, we're in an even bigger minority. Well, what's that like? John O'Bacon spoke at the Community Leadership Summit on the weekend, and he said, guys, if you want to know what it's like to be a woman in open source, go and get your nails done. And a week or so back, he went to get a manicure, and he walked into the salon, and he kind of went, I'm the only man here. That's a bit weird. Another example someone gave me is walking into a sports bar on game night wearing the wrong team's jersey. It can be the friendliest sports bar in the universe, and you're still going to feel a little awkward. So that's what it can be like for us in the open source community. And everyone's watching you, right? There's an enormous pressure to perform. People look at what you do and generalize it to all people that are part of your group. There are all kinds of subtle pressures. And this is true for every minority in our community, by the way, not just women. That's the blatant stuff. That's the subtle stuff. There's also blatant stuff. I'm talking about sexist jokes. I'm talking about pornographic conference presentations, of which we've had several this year. I'm also talking about online harassment and actually death threats against women in our community. I wish I were joking about this, and I'm not. The FlossPolls survey I mentioned earlier asked people if they'd noticed sexism in the open source community, and 80% of women said, hell yeah. 80% of men said, what? So that's a bit of a downer, and I'm not going to talk about that anymore. I'm going to talk about something positive, which is two projects in the open source world that have a majority of their developers who are female. And the first one is called An Archive of Our Own. It's a creation of a group called the Organisation for Transformative Works, which is committed to protecting and defending fanworks from commercial exploitation and legal challenges. So what that means is they support creators of fan fiction, fan videos, all sorts of creative things that fans make. And they're doing stuff like lobbying against DMCA restrictions of fair use. They've got an academic journal called Transformative Works and Cultures. And they're also building this open source fan fiction archive. And they went out to recruit developers for that. And they said, we're not going to recruit programmers, we're going to recruit people who want to work on this thing, whether or not they're programmers. So they actually went out and said, we'll teach you. And they said, we're going to get beginners to choose the language we use. And they had a Ruby versus Python deathmatch, where they asked non-programmers to go out and read 3 chapters of an introductory website about either language and write a simple little program. And they said, write this program, take some input, and tell us what happens, and then come back and tell us what your experience was like learning to program and learning to write this, and we'll choose a language based on that. The language they ended up choosing was Ruby, as it happens, and their project looks like this: 60,000 lines of Ruby on Rails and JavaScript. They've got 20-something coders. Every single one of them is a woman. There are some men involved in the project as well. They're doing sysadmin and some stuff like that, but to the best of my knowledge, none of them have committed any code. So the next thing is Dreamwidth. This is another project that is majority women. It's a fork of the LiveJournal code. That means it's a blogging and community platform, and it was started by some ex-LiveJournal staff who decided they could do it better. And the one man and one woman are the founders, Mark and Denise. They're here today. And they went out to create a really inclusive community. So this is what that project looks like. 210,000 lines of Perl, JavaScript, etc. 40-odd coders, 75% female. And again, they support beginners in their community. Like the archive, they're recruiting non-programmers and teaching them. They call new programmers, they call them baby devs. And they have an IRC channel, Dreamwidth Kindergarten, where you can go and get non-judgmental help. What really stood out for me about Dreamwidth is their diversity statement. They say, "We welcome people of any gender identity or expression, race, ethnicity, size, nationality, sexual orientation, ability level, religion, culture, subculture, and political opinion." That's right there on their website. They go on to say, "We think accessibility for people with disabilities is a priority, not an afterthought. We think neurodiversity is a feature, not a bug." And the upshot of this is that they have an open source community that looks like this. Or to put it more specifically, it looks like this. These are 28 Dreamwidth developers who sent in their photographs to be part of OSCON today. So I went out and I interviewed a bunch of Dreamwidth and archive developers and said to them, what's it been like? What are your experiences like? And also, what's your background? Where did you come from? Where did you learn to program? Have you had any experiences before in the open source community? And they said things like this. I've never contributed to an open source project before, or even considered that I could. I didn't feel like I was wanted. I never got the impression that outsiders were welcome. I considered getting involved in Debian, but the barriers to entry seemed high. And even if they did end up joining these projects, they had trouble getting started and getting productive. They said things like, it's kind of like being handed a box full of random bicycle parts. It doesn't help that you don't know how they go together, and all you want to do is ride the bike. People without a ton of experience get shunted off into side areas, and those side areas end up as the ladies' auxiliary. Then you see what happens on Dreamwidth in the archive. What I like most is there isn't any attitude of stand aside and let the grown-ups code. If there's something I'm able to contribute, then that contribution is welcome. And this is the one I love best. This is what she said. Deep down, I always assumed coding required this special kind of aptitude, something that I just didn't have and never would. It lost its forbidding mystique for me when I learned that people I'd assumed to be super coders had only started training a year ago. People without any prior experience, women like me. Jesus, it was like a barrier broke down in my mind. So what have we learned from this? Well, the thing I've learned from this is that if someone says women just aren't interested in technology or women aren't interested in open source, that's just manifestly untrue. Women are interested, and they're willing, and they're capable, and they're able to do this. They're just not joining existing open source projects. And I think that's great news. That is great news for new projects. If you're starting a new project, that means you have the opportunity to recruit these women. So I've got some tips for you. And the first thing I would suggest you do is recruit diversity from day one. The first members of your project will set the tone for your project, and people will look at it and go, is this somewhere I can see myself fitting in? I'd also suggest to recruit the sort of users you want to have. If you're working on, say, a music sharing application, recruit music lovers, recruit music fans. Don't worry about whether or not they can program. You can teach programming. You can't teach passion. And you can't teach diversity. The next thing I'd do is I'd suggest you get yourselves a code of conduct or a diversity statement, or possibly both. And use that to set the expectations for how members in your community will treat each other. Don't just mouth the words. I want you to put this on your website and believe in it and show people that you will hold them to it and stand by it. Set up a wiki for newbie developers. Set up your bug tracking tool to make it easy to find simple tasks that beginners can work on. Even do what Dreamwidth did and see if you can get a full hosted development environment with all the tools and libraries installed so people can come in and start hacking on day one. and feel like they're productive from the start. And communicate, not just to existing developers and users of your project, but also to newcomers and outsiders. Show them what your project is like on the inside. Give them an idea, if they joined, what would it be like for them? And make it something that they would want to join and be a part of. So all those things are easy for new projects. They're harder for old ones. Old projects have inertia, and it's hard to change the status quo, and I recognise that. I encourage you to try, but I recognise that it's difficult. But there are also things that every single person here can do as individuals. The first one is don't stare. If a woman comes into your community, welcome her, ply her with helpful information, thank her for her contributions, and don't point at her like she's in a zoo. I wish I didn't have to tell people this. Value every contribution on your project, whether it's code, documentation, bug reports, the person running a mailing list. Say, thanks, I really appreciate the work you're doing. And it's not only project leaders who can do this, anyone can do this. Just say to them, hey, you're doing a great job. And do this to everyone, not just women. I mean, you can thank everyone on your project, and it's a great thing to do. If someone's being an asshole, call him on his crap. If you're not sure if someone's being an asshole, here's a hint. If there is a naked lady up on the screen, someone is probably being an asshole. Let them know that their behaviour is scaring away developers and that you don't like it. Don't worry about what I think. Worry about what you think. Tell them you don't like it. And pay attention to the little stuff as well. Keep your eyes open for anything that you might be doing or that people in your community might be doing to discourage people, any people, and make them feel unwelcome. This is probably the hardest piece of advice I have for you. You're not used to noticing this stuff. 80% of men in the open source community have not noticed sexism in our community. You're guys, you get to float through life and not notice this stuff. I'm asking you not to do that. I'm asking you to try not to ignore it. If you're white, if you're able-bodied, if you're straight, if you speak English and have a university education, those are a bunch of other things you get to float through life ignoring and just think that life is easy. Please try not to. So those are just a few tips I've picked up from working on Dreamwidth and the Archive of Our Own, and I hope they're useful to you. I know there are only 2 projects, and I know they're very new projects, but it's certainly a start. So I want to leave you with this thought. Here's our picture of the open source community. What do you think happens to this picture when we get more women in this picture? Do you think some of those little blue figures turn pink? That's not the way it works. It works like this. Any step you take to increase the diversity of your project will work to broaden the overall developer pool. And we're not in a situation yet where we're far enough along in our steps towards world domination where we can afford to turn anyone away. Thank you.